They didn't chain American women. They didn't lock them away. They didn't need to. Because by the late 1800s, control no longer required force. It lived in manners, in fashion, in silence. What most people don't realize is that many of the strict rules that governed American women were never American at all. They came quietly, from Victorian England, across the Atlantic. And once they arrived, they never truly left. This is not a story about dresses and tea parties. It's a story about invisible rules. Rules so deeply embedded in daily life that women followed them without ever being told. And once you see them, you'll start to notice them everywhere. If you value real history beyond textbooks, subscribe now. This channel explores the stories that were never meant to be told. Victorian England didn't conquer America with armies. It influenced it with ideals. During the 19th century, America looked to Britain as a cultural authority. British fashion, etiquette, morality, and gender roles were treated as signs of refinement. To behave properly meant behaving like the English upper class. By the mid-1800s, America had embraced a belief system known as true womanhood. It was never written as law, but it governed lives more effectively than any law ever could. According to this ideal, a woman had 4 virtues: piety, purity, submission, domesticity. If a woman failed in even one, her entire reputation could collapse. A woman was expected to be morally superior, but socially powerless. Strong, but silent. Influential, but invisible. If this kind of hidden history matters to you, subscribe. American women absorbed these expectations early, through magazines, through sermons, through schools, through mothers teaching daughters what a good woman should be. Slowly, a quiet belief took root. A woman's value was not in what she did, but in how well she behaved. Subscribe if you're interested in how power hides inside culture. Victorian rules didn't just shape behavior. They shaped bodies. Corsets restricted breathing. Heavy dresses restricted movement. Long hair symbolized femininity, but required endless labor. Looking proper was exhausting by design, because a woman too tired to move freely was a woman easier to control. In America, these fashions were celebrated as signs of civilization. In reality, they were tools of compliance. Subscribe for stories that challenge what beauty once cost. Victorian culture prized restraint, especially in women. A woman who spoke too much was seen as improper. A woman who argued was seen as dangerous. American women learned early that silence was safety. Public speech belonged to men. Opinions belonged to men. Authority belonged to men. Women were encouraged to influence quietly, through tone, mood, and obedience. Subscribe if you're noticing how silence is taught, not chosen. Victorian ideals allowed women to be educated, but only to a point. Reading was encouraged. Writing was acceptable. Critical thinking? That was risky. Too much knowledge might produce independence. American women were taught enough to be cultured companions, not decision-makers. Subscribe for the stories behind what women were never taught. In Victorian thinking, marriage was not optional. It was destiny. An unmarried woman past a certain age was pitied, or mocked, or feared. In America, this pressure intensified. Marriage became proof of worth. Once married, a woman's legal identity often merged with her husband. Her labor became expected. Her obedience assumed. Subscribe if you want the truth behind traditional values. Victorian morality demanded purity from women, but forgave men. A woman's reputation could be ruined permanently by a single rumor. A man's mistakes were often overlooked. This imbalance wasn't accidental. It kept women cautious, fearful, controlled. Subscribe for more uncomfortable truths from history. Not all American women could afford elegance, but Victorian rules still applied. Working-class women were judged by standards they could not meet. They were expected to be modest while working exhausting jobs, quiet while struggling to survive. Their labor was essential, yet rarely respected. Subscribe to hear the stories history usually ignores. Churches reinforced Victorian values weekly. Sermons praised obedience, self-sacrifice, endurance. American women were taught that suffering quietly was noble. Faith became a tool, not of freedom, but of endurance. Subscribe if you want to understand how belief shapes behavior. The most powerful rules are the ones people don't question. Victorian expectations were passed down as tradition, as common sense, as morality. By the time women questioned them, they felt natural. Subscribe if you want to learn how norms are manufactured.
The most powerful rules are the ones people don't question. Victorian expectations were passed down as tradition, as common sense, as morality. By the time women questioned them, they felt natural. Subscribe if you want to learn how norms are manufactured. Some women resisted quietly, through writing, through education, through refusing to disappear. But resistance came at a cost. Reputation, marriage prospects, social exile. Subscribe for the stories of women who pushed back anyway. Victorian rules didn't vanish. They evolved. Ideas about modesty, about appropriate behavior, about women's roles, they echo in modern expectations, in judgment, in shame. Subscribe if you believe the past still shapes the present. American women were never simply controlled. They were trained. Trained to behave, to endure, to carry rules so quietly they felt like choices. Understanding this history is not about blame. It's about awareness. Because once you see invisible rules, you can finally decide whether to follow them. Subscribe for more deep, honest history that respects your intelligence.